The Strait of Hormuz is one of the most important and most dangerous maritime choke points on Earth. Around a fifth of the world's oil and liquefied natural gas passes through this narrow stretch of water. And right now, it's not just a trade route, it's on the front line of a widening conflict involving Iran, the United States, and Israel. Iran is exerting control over shipping moving through the strait. At the same time, the United States has imposed a naval blockade targeting Iranian ports. The result is a de facto double blockade, and a sea lane the global economy depends on is grinding to a halt. So what exactly governs security at sea when war breaks out? What rules still apply, and which ones start to fall apart? And if the rules are being tested here, what does that mean for other vital choke points around the world? To understand this, I spoke with someone who has spent years studying maritime security, international law, and how states behave at sea.
We need to think more pragmatically and ask, how can we actually use the law to get shipping back through the Strait of Hormuz, rather than ending up in these questions of who's right and who's wrong, which will be very, very difficult to solve.
Christian Bueger is Professor of International Relations at the University of Copenhagen. He's one of the leading experts on how global power, law, and conflict intersects on the world's oceans. He's even written a book on the subject called Understanding Maritime Security. To figure out what's happening in the Strait of Hormuz today, we first need to understand how the law of the sea works and what happens to it when peace gives way to war.
So we have two types of law. One is the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea, and that is the big foundational treaty. And under that treaty, there's innocent passage, meaning that the moment that you don't endanger the coastal state should provide you freedom of navigation. Then we have the body of law that is under the International Maritime Organization, and that provides rules for safe passage through straits. And in the past, we had a transit regime that clearly outlines how you can go through the strait under the International Maritime Organization. So these are the two main bodies of law. However, they only apply to peacetime. And the moment that we're in a situation of war, it is more contested whether these rules still apply, and states very often then resort to customary law.
Okay, so the peacetime rules don't apply. What about wartime rules? Once states begin acting as if they are at war, even without formally declaring it, those rules start to blur. And that's where the legal arguments become far more contested.
Both the United States and Iran claim that their current actions are within the law. And it's clear that if you are in a war-like situation, then you can block the shipping of belligerent states, so states that participate in the war. But here it starts to get tricky. When and how can a ship actually directly be linked to a war party? Is, for instance, a ship that is flagged by the UK carrying fertilizers, should that be seen as part of the war parties? The UK does not directly support the war efforts, but military facilities on UK territory have been used in the war.
This is where maritime law starts to collide with geopolitics. Modern shipping is global, layered, and interconnected. Ships might be flagged by one country, owned in another, insured in a third, and trading with dozens more. Determining whether a vessel is genuinely linked to a conflict is extraordinarily difficult, and that ambiguity has consequences well beyond the Persian Gulf. The real question, therefore, is whether this moment becomes a precedent, one that other states could use to assert control over strategically vital waterways around the world.
So what we're looking at is an increasingly attempt to exercise political control over key waterways. This actually started with the Panama Canal. A lot of people have forgotten that the US government made several assertions vis-a-vis the Panama Canal as well. So this is the first observation that we can make, more political control over key waterways. But what we are witnessing right now is also that our legal provisions are insufficient. What can you actually do to block a strait and what not? And there are also other related questions, such as, for instance, how can you use naval mines in such situations? What kind of obligations do countries have to clear the mines? Is it allowed to use floating mines? So there's a lot of big questions at stake, and these will highly matter for the Strait of Malacca and Singapore, for the Suez Canal, for the Strait of Taiwan, and so on. So potentially, if we do not go back to the drawing board in terms of the law, we are looking at a highly unstable future maritime environment where situations like the one that we're in right now could return again. So it's important to not only think about the current emergency situation, but think broader and work towards long-term solutions.
If the current legal framework isn't enough, then what comes next? In the short term, states are turning to naval coalitions and military escorts to keep shipping moving. Europe is already planning a mission of this kind, a defensive operation to protect commercial vessels in the Strait of Hormuz. But as Christian explains, military deployment alone won't solve what is essentially a structural legal problem.
So first of all, we need some sort of political agreement between Iran and the United States. That right now doesn't look very good, but that is the precondition for the European mission. European nations and other nations have been busy meeting over the last week to get a coalition in place, and that will imply a naval presence in and around the Strait of Hormuz. It will require mine clearing capabilities, and all of this is really needed to provide reassurance to the shipping industry to reduce the risk levels. Ideally, this military coalition would also start working on the long-term solutions that we need for the strait, which could be a new treaty mechanism like we have in the Strait of Malacca and Singapore, or going back to the International Maritime Organization and develop a new form of transit regime. The planners right now, they are suggesting that this will be a military mission of 3 to 6 months, but I don't think this will happen. It is entirely unrealistic. Provocations will continue, and we are rather looking at naval operations in the range of 2 to 5 years. That is plausible and realistic. So it will be a longer game than is currently suggested.
2 to 5 years. That means maritime security in the Strait of Hormuz needs long-term solutions and not just emergency response. Even if Iran's regime survives, even if the war de-escalates, the Strait of Hormuz will not simply snap back to how things were before. Christian argues that the old model was already unstable, and recent events have only exposed that reality.
This is a permanent shift. We will not go back to the status quo. That is entirely utopic. We need to find new, more stable solutions for how the Strait of Hormuz can be governed in the long run, because otherwise the risk that we end up in a situation that we have right now is extremely high. And let's also remind ourselves that even before the current war, there were ongoing incidents linked to Iran. There was a drone attack. There were a couple of seizures of ships on questionable legal grounds and so on. So we should not return to what we had before. We need to start thinking about how can we design an efficient governance regime for the Strait of Hormuz and then also in the long run for other straits.
All of this raises a bigger question. Are we watching the rules-based order at sea slowly erode? Or is this a moment of stress that could ultimately produce stronger, more realistic rules?
We are clearly seeing a moment of heavy contestation. That doesn't mean that the international order is eroding. International law is still there. International organizations play an important role. We have seen that the United States has been seeking legitimacy from the UN Security Council a number of times. So these are good examples that we are not seeing a full erosion of the international order. But this is a moment of contestation, and in that sense, it is also an opportunity to develop better and more stable rules for the seas in the long run. Difficult moment, but also an opportunity.
So we're at a crossroads. What happens next in the Strait of Hormuz affects all of us. How states respond will shape maritime security, not just in the Gulf, but across the world's oceans for years to come. So what do you think? What rules should apply to maritime choke points? Let us know in the comments. We'll keep you updated on all the latest developments across DW's platforms. I'm Ole Alsager in Berlin. Until next time.